By subscribing to iCatholic Mobile, you help fund programs that connect you to everything Catholic and provide that lifeline to others in need. With every dollar earned, a portion goes to Catholic media, education, and the formation of souls. Join today at iCatholicMobile.com.
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be hampered through Christ our Lord. Amen. Queen of Confessors, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, the last conference is on a topic. Some of you probably heard the word, but we want to do a bit more of a deep dive into it. It's called sophistry. And basically, what we're seeing, not just outside the church, but even inside the church, we're seeing an awful lot of sophistry. And it has to do with the fact that when you watch things on TV, or even when you hear even bishops talk, they're saying stuff that you know isn't true. And you listen to their argument, and you know their argument isn't necessarily sound. You might even know why it's not very sound. But they keep pushing the same kinds of things that we've heard for decades that just don't work, or just simply we know it's false. So I want to take a look at what that actually entails more concretely so that we can get a better sense of it, and so that you can, A, not just recognize it, but then also be able to more easily tune it out. Okay. So what exactly is sophistry? Well, the first one to really talk about it at length was Plato. And basically, if you take a close look at it, it's a form of rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is a form of persuasion, which is distinct from argumentation. Argumentation, philosophically, is not where you're yelling and screaming at each other. Argumentation is actually a syllogistic reasoning. It's a process where you use formal logic in order to start with a set of premises and arrive at a specific conclusion. So that's what argumentation actually is. And a lot of times, so then you know that if all A or B and all B or C, therefore you know all A or C, you know based upon logic rules how our mind is structured in order to know the truth, but also the truth of the premises that you know that the conclusion follows. And so according to the philosophers, if you actually have use of reason and you know the truth of the proposition and you actually know the terms of the proposition, of the first two premises, then when the conclusion is drawn, reason will naturally see it, and you know that it's true. It's not a question of choice at that point. It's just you recognize that it's actually the truth of the actual matter. That does not mean that everybody who actually knows what the truth of that situation is going to tell you that they know that it's true, or that they're actually going to proceed as if it's true. Whereas rhetoric is a form of persuasion, and it means that, you can use syllogistic reasoning in it from time to time, but basically what you're doing is you're setting out a set of premise or a set of propositions that compel the person or convince them that what the truth actually is. But with sophistry, we're talking about a form of that's under normal rhetoric. So if you read the Rhetoric of Aristotle, that's what he's talking about. And in that process, you're actually looking. You wouldn't necessarily use a syllogistic argument to convince people of a political position, although if people were perfectly rational, you would. But they don't. Instead, you have to appeal to what their likes, their dislikes are, their emotions, etc., on a certain level. Now, that can have a proper place, but it can also be to the detriment when people are just always following their emotions. But you can start with that and then lead them to the actual truth. That's what rhetoric is supposed to ultimately be. So if you read Aristotle's Rhetoric, that's what it's about. But sophistry, rather, is a form of rhetoric. So it's a form of persuading people which does not seek the truth. In other words, that's one of the hallmarks about it. You can see this on television. Somebody will set up somebody will give an argument, and then the other person will completely deconstruct the argument, show that it's completely contrary to reality, the facts, and everything like that. And then what the person does is that they ignore the fact that their argument has shown to be untrue, and they keep pushing it, but then they just switch tactics on it. We know it's not the case, for example, the X, Y, and Z, but they still keep pushing it, okay? But rather, with sophistry, because it doesn't seek the truth, it seeks to undermine sound argumentation, sound reasoning. It's actually contrary to reason. They're actually using their verbal skills and their linguistic skills in order to undermine the truth and actually get you to buy into something that's actually false. And the reason they actually do that, according to Plato and Aristotle, is because they're trying to gain something. The technical term for that is it's officious. They're trying to gain something in the process, and they don't care about the truth. They're going to just give you any argument or say anything that's necessary in order to persuade you to follow this, a line of argumentation so that you'll do what they want or give them what they want. This is why Plato defines sophistry as, this is a very key argument, or key definition, we're going to unpack this a lot. He defines it as making the lesser argument appear the greater. In other words, you're talking about something that may or may not be true, but it doesn't necessarily apply, or it's just not as important as what the real issue is. You know. So, and this is, I'll give you a classic example of how we're actually seeing it. Putting aside the whole question of due process, the fact of the matter is that the whole discussion about, booting this guy out and sending him to Venezuela, or El Salvador, one side is basically saying, look, we had to get rid of this guy because he's a danger to our country. The other side ignores the truth of that proposition and simply starts pushing a narrative or an agenda in order to promote or to achieve a specific thing that they want, which is basically what? Just to undermine the president, or just to keep as many Democratic voters here as possible, or whatever the case is. But it's not, when you listen to their arguments, it never reaches the threshold. So, for example, they'll say, oh, well, we're not American unless we allow all immigrants in. Well, there's a thing called the common good, and the common good requires protection of the borders, etc. That's the stronger argument, but they ignore all of that, and they're constantly, and what do? Their appeal is emotional. They're appealing to some emotional or some aspect of it, pulling on your heartstrings or trying to get you, that's the persuasion part, to get you to sign off on that and then just ignore what you know to be the actual truth. Well, here's the problem with it. You keep doing that, and this is what's happened in our culture. We have been living under this rubric for at least 60 to 70 years because the communists have been using it in our culture for that long, if not longer, actually, probably since the 1920s. And so if you ever want to read a phenomenal book, to get two books to give you a deep sense of the fact that the communists use this stuff all the time. They always have. From the very beginning, they've used these types of tactics, and that these are actually present in our countries. All you have to do is look at Bella Dodd's The School of Darkness and Skozen's The Naked Communist, because you find out that by the 40s, they had already infiltrated large segments of our government. And so they were using various arguments along this way in order to undermine what's actually, so we're living under this. And of course they got into the universities now, and now they're presenting this. And so you have this problem of people they're not arriving at the truth. They don't know how to reason well. They don't understand even how to follow reason. And if anybody who presents a reasonable argument, they're looked at in suspicion now, because people have been habituated in this sophistry to follow the emotional argument, which in the end very often is the lesser argument. It might be true, but it's not the truth, or it's not as true, it's not as important. We do have to treat all the people that come across the border with a certain civility and a certain justice and a certain charity. That doesn't derogate from the fact that they don't belong here and we got to get them out of here, otherwise it's going to undermine the common good. So there's that problem that you tend to see that ends up happening because, the heartstrings of, this is so important, we have to do this, we have to do this. Look, I'm not, again, it goes back to, we have become so habituated, we can't actually see which truth is more important in the process, okay? And very often they just tell you stuff that's just out and out lies, right? In order to persuade you, because they know that if they keep saying it, eventually that you'll be persuaded by it. So it's when the lesser argument, they try and make it appear the greater, and the way they appear it has to do with a very specific psychological mechanism in human beings, and this is how it works. Every time we have what's called an antecedent emotion, we have an emotion. When our intellect goes to make a judgment about that, that emotion is actually, once we have it, that emotional, that sense experience of that emotion gets into our imagination. And so when we go to make a judgment, which the intellect requires to be able to look at the image in the imagination to make a judgment, then what happens is that the emotion, St. Thomas says, draws our judgment to excess or defect. It makes something seem worse than it is or better than it is, rather than as it is. And we all know this to be the case. All of us who have been angry make a judgment about this is the thing to say, or this is okay to say in this moment, or this is proportionate to what this person's doing. And then after the anger subsides, we realize that our judgment was drawn to excess. We really shouldn't have said that was actually bad. We've all experienced that. This is why when on the news media, when there's this constant emotional appeal all the time, that's a problem. Because it's habituating people into following their emotions, which is the lesser argument, rather than right reason. And this is a consistent thing that we're actually seeing across the board. The premises may or may not be true. I'll give you a couple of examples. Or one example, even within the church. The trads are bad people, therefore we have to suppress the Mass. Okay. The fact that there are traditionalists that are bad people, we all admit that. Some of them are pretty angry people. We all get that. That has nothing to do with whether the Mass should be suppressed or not. So in other words, they're appealing to a negative emotion to say, see, if we get rid of the Mass, then we won't have this problem. Oh no, you're just going to have angry trads that don't have the Mass, right? So there's not, and this is also, I've mentioned it before, we have to embrace the modern world. We have to quit acting, like we're this isolated island and we don't have anything to do with those outside the church and this and that. We have to stop doing that. We have to embrace the modern world and help people, say, okay, first of all, time out. Someone should have stood up during, not just the council, but someone should have stood up in the 50s and said, excuse me, your argumentation is completely flawed because the number of conversions, the fact that the Catholics were bringing them, the non-Catholics, the actual approach that the Catholic Church had, the number of conversions was at a historical high in the 1950s. We didn't need to change everything in order to, because they were saying, well, nobody, the churches, nobody wants the church, nobody needs this. Excuse me, the number of conversions were off the charts. This simply was not true. The perception of the time, they were constantly jading the perception of the time in order to undermine the church's discipline, to undermine certain things. There was this attitude, we need to adapt the Mass for this reason and that reason, because if we do that, we'll get more people in. Well, it didn't work. The number of people going to Mass is in decline. And they're still pretending, they still keep pushing the same old arguments over and over again. And it's obviously a lesser argument because it's not working. Okay, so this is the thing that we see even in the church. In an argumentation, so the premises may or may not be true, but it doesn't really matter. They're going to promote it. The premises may or may not apply to the argument at hand. Now, this is why I can't watch more than 5 minutes of even the most conservative news on TV. Because they'll ask some guy a question, don't you agree that X, Y, and Z, which is an established fact that everybody agrees. So what does the guy do? He doesn't actually say, yes, that's actually true. No, what he does is he talks about something that has nothing to do with what the question had just got done doing. That's when you know, okay, the guy's a sophist. He's just trying to argue in favor of something without actually addressing reality or the facts. So, I'll give you another example, which they'll use something which has nothing to do with the actual thing, but they make it look like it does. For example, they'll say things like transgenders should have the same type of protection as the races do, right? So there should, based on the race laws, then basically we should not have any prejudice whatsoever against trans, just as we don't have any prejudice against races. Okay. First of all, what race you have is completely out of your control. You're just born there, right? A transgender is not born that way. It's a formational issue. They all know that. Even the modern studies have come out to show that. They're always trying to look for the gene for this or that, and it just never works. And they've never found one. But they're always trying to do that. But it doesn't mean that you don't treat transgenders with a certain civility and matter of justice. That's not the issue. That does not mean, therefore, that, for example, it would be immoral to basically say, I can't hire you because you're black to teach this course to children. Because the fact that he's black has nothing to do with his moral character. His moral character is the result of his choices. Wanting to dress like a man when you're a woman, or a woman like you're a man, that's a choice. And that's the difference. So what they're trying to do is they'll take the terms and make them look like they're the same when they're not. Again, this is part of the premises don't necessarily apply, but because they're trying to appeal to people's emotions, it makes it look like it does. Or the premises never rise to the actual argument regarding the truth. This is another problem that they do. So, in other words, the argumentation that they're using never rises to actually an actual argument regarding the truth. For example, I mentioned this before, the church needs to embrace the modern world. No, it doesn't need to embrace the world, because that's really what happened. And the fact that it's modern has no bearing on it whatsoever. Modern man is not essentially different from any other generation since the time of Adam. It still suffers from all the wounds of original sin, ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence. It suffers from the same sets of problems. It still suffers from the same sets of issues in relationship to their sinfulness. The fact that they actually would say that modern man is different, really? That generation just boggles my mind when they say that because of this one reason. They say that modern man is different, and so we don't have to have all these disciplines. We don't have to do all these things to make sure that the right thing is done because modern man is just different. Really? You just saw Mao wipe out 100 million people. You just saw Stalin starve out 20 million people in the Ukraine. You just saw millions of people wiped out during the Second World War under your watch. You were there. And then you're telling us that somehow or another we're different, we don't have to worry about these things? You're not even in contact with reality. But this is actually the difficulty that we're actually seeing. That their arguments that modern man is different, it doesn't even rise to regarding the truth. That's just not true. Modern man is not different. If anything, he's more evil in his behavior. The church didn't need the church need reform? Actually, it did, but not of its disciplines. What it needed was reform of the people in the church. Because at the time of the Second Vatican Council, or actually in the 1950s, when all the call for reforms were being called for, what really needed to change was the hearts of the people. Because I mentioned they didn't want to embrace their cross. But you've also probably heard me say this too. Everyone's got this idea that the fornication really began in earnest with the hippie generation because it was out in the open. That's not where it began. It began in the 1950s. It was quiet because the morals had collapsed. And how do we, among the sexual morals had collapsed in the church. How do we know this? Because almost all of the pedophilia issues, the homosexual issues, and all the priests sleeping with women issues that occurred in the 70s and in the 80s were the guys that were in the seminaries in the 50s. That's when it actually happened. And so what we needed was reform of our hearts, reform of the people in the church, not the actual discipline of the church. We see sophistry all over the place. For example, you'll hear them say, this is a perfect example of this, is they find out that there are, hordes and hordes of people collecting Social Security, and they're over the age of 130. What do we hear from the people who don't want that to be stopped? You're cutting people's benefits off of Social Security. That's not what we're doing. We're stopping people who aren't even alive from receiving it. But you see this, the sophistry is trying to make that the argument they use is trying to tell people that they're just trying to deny people's right to Social Security, rather than actually dealing with the actual argument. I mean, obviously, if the current administration was going to just start slashing Social Security, that would be another issue. But they're not. They're just trying to clean up people who have no business getting it. There was a woman in California. This is a little while ago. It doesn't have to do with the current situation, but it gets to what the current situation, how we've got things structured, even in our own government, can actually be a problem. There was a woman in California that was receiving welfare under 200 different aliases. Her income was over $200,000 a month from the government. And the only reason she got caught, she was living in Beverly Hills. The only reason she got caught is because her friends said that's not right and reported her. But this tells you that, when they sit there and then they'll turn around and say, oh, you're trying to cut off people's welfare. No, that's not what's happening here. But this is, again, it's shifting the argument. Anytime you see the argument shifting to something other than what's actually going on, you know that sophistry is part of this. And they're going to use it. Why are they appealing to? You're cutting off people's Social Security, which is basically what? They're appealing to the emotions to make that look like the real issue when it's not. Another thing that they do is they argue making the exception the rule. The exception is the lesser argument, and the rule is the greater. So for a common one, which you'll actually see is, where did the government get the idea that somehow or another that it should basically have the degree of control over how parents exercise their rights in relationship to the child? Where did they ever get this idea? So certain people, okay, it's true that certain people gravely harm their children. And so they'll say that, oh, well, there's children getting hurt, therefore the government has to get involved. No, it doesn't. It might have to get involved in specific isolated cases. That doesn't mean it has to be involved in the day-to-day life of how parents are actually raising their children. It has no business being there. In fact, one of the things, to give you an idea that we have completely succumbed to sophistry has to do with this. In the Middle Ages, the government had practically no role in the day-to-day life of people. Practically no role. It wasn't until the Protestant revolt that the government started stepping in and controlling a large aspects of I should say in a more extensive way, controlling various aspects of the politics, and that the government from there started to become more and more and more important in people's lives. So it actually went viral when I said that the government is not entitled to more than God. Therefore, the government, in all forms of taxation, it's immoral for them to tax more than 10% in all forms of taxes combined. They're not entitled to more than God. They're not God, but somehow or another, they think they're actually more important than the actual art. They're in every aspect of our life, and they have no business being in there. Take, for example, the fact that, we have all these entitlement programs. Where a lot of that started had to do with Roosevelt, who was a card-carrying communist. Literally, if you can actually listen to his speech where he just openly states all the communist stuff. He openly states it. But he was the one who started all this stuff, and then the starting of Social Security was originally supposed to help widows. Well, what should have happened is the government should have incentivized it to help people of means to help widows, to help the church help widows. Those are the parts, the entitlement programs like welfare and all these things, taking care of people who are sick, all that stuff. The government shouldn't be involved in any of that. That should be the place of the church, not the government. Because every time they take money from someone in order to pay for these other things, when it's not necessary for the common good, that by the common good I mean something that falls directly under their authority, they are essentially committing theft against the citizenry. Actually, it's technically robbery because it's under the threat of violence, because you're going to put you in jail. The reason I'm going into all this is that the sophistry that somehow or another the government is important has become a gargantuan problem. The fact that you turn on the news media and 90% of what you watch has to do with the government. It should be the exact opposite. 10% of the news should be about the government. The rest should be about all the other stuff that's actually important in people's lives. It's upside down. It's not until the government ceases being as important as it likes to think it is. It's gotten too big for its britches, to be quite frank. But this has to do with the fact that the sophistry, people have gotten sucked into actually thinking that the government's important, and it shouldn't be as important as they like to think it is. It has a specific role. If they actually went back to what the original founders in this country had originally, it'd probably be a little bit closer to where they actually should function. But another place is it has to do with the parents. You hear that, it takes a village. Really? So, and that has to do with this attitude. And I can't remember which politician said it, is that the children belong to the state. No, they don't. They belong to the parents, not to the state. And so this is a sign, again, and again, it's all based on sophistry. Oh, well, some parents aren't raising their kids right. The reason why the government has to be involved in education is because some parents just don't educate their kids well enough in this. Okay, we're back to your making the exception appear greater than the actual rule. The rule is that the parents should be taking care of that stuff. Because some parents don't educate their kids right, therefore the state has the primary role to educate the children, is what we're told, which is not the case. Parents are the primary educators by the teaching of the church and even by the natural law. In fact, the very phrase in loco parentis, somehow or another that gets lost on most educators today. They think that, oh no, we get to do what we want in our classroom. No, you don't. You're acting on behalf of the parents, not on your own. And these children aren't yours. They actually belong to the parents. But this is, again, all part of the actual sophistry. The natural law has so collapsed in our secular sphere that they are struggling to provide an adequate argument as to why parents should have any say over their teaching of 5 to 8 years old regarding sodomy. They're literally struggling. I don't know, how do we argue this? It's like the time I was sitting next to a cardinal. He's a good guy. He's I think a morally man, probably holier than I am. But he's talking about the whole transgender thing and all of that. And he's just like, the church is just going to have to come up with some answer to this. I almost looked at him like, what planet are you and I are not in the same religion? Because if we were in the same religion, we would both agree all the church has to do is teach the natural law and it's over. But the church hasn't been teaching the natural law. But the fact that he couldn't even see that the natural law was the solution, that the church already had the answer, is flabbergasting. And that's a sign that, again, people, they see these lesser arguments, like, how are we going to answer this? Well, all you have to do is actually give the answer, to state the truth on a consistent basis over and over again. But this is the fact that again, the natural law has collapsed. People don't even see the natural law as having any binding force in relationship to it. In the church, they were saying that active lay participation in the liturgy, that's the lesser argument, is seen as taking precedence over the liturgy giving God his due worship, literally. You see this among certain clergy. They're actually more worried about whether someone's going to be offended by what they say in the liturgy than whether God's going to be offended. This is a problem. In fact, God bless him, I always loved the guy. I mean, he had some problematic theological issues, but I thought that he was a holy man. He was trying to do what he thought was right. It was Cardinal Ratzinger, later to become Pope Benedict. Cardinal Ratzinger was invited to Vigratsbad, where the fraternity has its seminary, and he did the first solemn pontifical mass that he had done in decades. And after the mass, he came into the sacristy and said, "I had forgotten how theocentric the old rite was." Unpack what that he just said. Now, by the way, I know he knew that was a problem in the current ritual, that it's become so homocentric, so centric on human beings, that we've kind of lost God in the process. And the way we know this is because of the fact that if we actually believe that was God, first of all, you wouldn't have your back to him. But the second of all is that the way he would be handled in communion would be a completely different animal. So he even knew some of the problems. He saw these problems. But that tells you, though, that even in the church, they literally used a lesser argument to bludgeon the church to completely reform the liturgy in such a manner that it actually stripped the glory that was given to God. And that's, again, making the lesser argument appear the greater. It doesn't mean that the lay people shouldn't have a participation in it, but it should be interior in unifying their sacrifice that they're doing with the sacrifice of the priest. That's the fundamental aspect of it. Okay, so this was the whole thing that actually, and until we get over this sophistry, even in the church, but it's in the government. You can't watch 5 minutes of news media without sophistry being all over the place, even among the best. And they've all gotten sucked into it, where there's certain arguments that are clearly the elephant in the room, and yet they just avoid those things, like the plague, in order to just stick with this one thing which is, okay for everybody to talk about. After a while, when the sophistry becomes so endemic like it is in the church and in the world, it starts to become motivated by malice. Because sophistry is making the lesser argument appear the greater. What's malice? Choosing the lesser good over the greater good. If you are going to pursue and ignore the greater a truth, or to ignore the truth, or to ignore a truth that's more important in a particular situation, to pursue a lesser truth because it's more comfortable or everything, over the course of time, when you keep choosing that, you're just going to become malicious, where you're just going to choose the lesser good over the greater good, period. And this is a sign that our culture is imbued, and that the more relativistic it becomes, the more the malice and the sophistry are just going to take over. That's where we're at in our culture. Now that you're depressed. So what's the solution to it? Well, the first part of it is proper education and intellectual formation. We've got to get away from all this nonsense and actually go back to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and actually learning logic and things like that. The second, so just on an educational level, it all has to change. We've got to get away from everything that's driving that and just get back to the foundations, because in reading, you actually learn how to think. You learn how people, if it's the right stuff. In arithmetic, you actually are using certain kinds of logic skills and a structured way of thinking, because arithmetic is basically, mathematics is basically the structure it's supposed to be, although the upper levels of mathematics have become completely detached from reality. But true mathematics is actually going to help you to see reality, so it keeps you in contact with reality. Reading, writing, and writing, the writing requires what? Composition. Our mind has a specific structure, and so even our grammar is based upon how our mind is structured in order to think in a logical fashion. And so going back to those things will help to actually develop that and to rebuild that to some degree. But then again, teaching logic. Another thing is I'd really recommend this. I'm thinking of actually doing a series of videos on it, just short videos. But you should really get a book on informal fallacies. Because the informal fallacies today are just so ridiculously off the charts. The fact that there's, the various kinds of informal, like ad hominem, right? Instead of somebody brings up an argument, what do? They attack the individual instead of dealing with their argument. Well, that doesn't help, right? And so that's just one example. There's a whole series of them, and if you actually know what the informal fallacies are, you can't watch 5 minutes of discussion on TV without realizing the whole thing is just absurd. But then, I really recommend you study it. It doesn't require a whole lot of reading. In fact, you can buy some really good books on informal fallacies. My suggestion is to buy a book that is a reprint of something that's been out of print for about 50 to 70 years. Because if you get some of the more recent stuff, it starts getting a little dicey. So the first is that the second part about it is that we have to stop being malicious ourselves. We have to be willing to pursue the greater truth or the greater good, and that means that we're going to have to be willing to fight for the truth when our state in life and our circumstances require it, not just letting it go every single time. So we have to be willing to stand up against them when we see that this is just not the case. This is actually the fundamental problem that we had even in the church, where a lot of times these guys knew that what was coming down the pike or that what was being proposed was actually bad, but nobody would speak up or do anything about it. I mean, just look at the whole thing on synodality. How many bishops actually spoke up against that? A handful. Just a handful. That's it. The rest all just sat there, which tells you they're more mercenaries, because mercenary is basically you're a hireling, and so as soon as the wolf comes, you run off because you don't want to get hurt. Whereas a true shepherd is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. He's willing to suffer, but they don't want to do that. But they have to be willing to stand up. The second thing is stop listening to their arguments, because they're just trying to appeal to you, and they're just trying to just stop listening to them. We have to, in our culture, we have to stop giving these people a hearing. Once we recognize that they're not interested in the truth, that they're just trying to sell something or gain something from us, we need to just cut them off and stop listening and not give them a platform in order to talk. I suppose there's always Twitter and Facebook. But we have to stop. But even there, people have to stop listening to them. And this is one of the reasons I tell people, look, just stop watching television news. Just stop watching it. You need to get your news to some degree, but there's places where you can get your news. And even the best of them out there, you have to wade through a little bit of it and don't spend a whole lot of time on it. But we have to stop giving them a hearing. The minute we discover that they're not being honest, they're not being truthful, we just got to cut them off and say, until you're willing to actually talk about the arguments in a rational, coherent way without appealing to the emotions or making all these emotional appeals, we're not going to listen to you. Because that's what they would do in the past. In the past, as soon as someone would become emotional or give an emotional argument, people had a natural inclination, because they were naturally virtuous to some degree. Their natural inclination was to do what? Dismiss them. As soon as somebody becomes emotional, if you're a rational human being, your first response is what? What they're saying, what they're talking about, and what they're going on is it's don't paying attention to it. Just ignore it until they calm down. Then you can go talk to them. Why? Because we intuitively knew that if they're emotional, their judgment isn't sound. It's either excessive or defective. And so we just didn't pay attention to them. We've got to stop giving these people a hearing. The next thing we have to do is we have to stop tolerating the practices that were put in place by Saul Alinsky. Now, how many of you know anything about Saul Alinsky? Okay. This guy did an enormous amount of damage to our country, actually worldwide. Because basically, when you read, first of all, he dedicates his book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer. But when you read this guy's tactics, it's what you see demons doing all the time, actually. Appealing to people emotionally, this, that, or the other thing. But one of the things that drives me out of my mind is people who are rational generally have a sense of decency. Generally, if they're rational, they're not going to, when you're entering into a discussion with somebody, if a person's rational, they'll start presenting the argument. If someone rebuts it, what they'll very often do is wait until the person finishes saying what they're going to say, and then they'll address that particular topic. But that's what rational people generally do. They have a sense of decency. And so as a result of that, they know that based on human communication, only one person can really be talking at the same time, right? That's not what Saul Alinsky taught them to do. He taught them that if you're losing the argument, or if it's shown that your argument is actually false or it's contradicted to where it looks like your argument's going to lose, what you do is you just start yelling and talking over the person and power your way through it, so that you're the one that gets to do the talking and not the other person who's contradicting what you say. That's why I can't watch anything, even on Fox News. There's this particular one individual on there. If I was sitting there talking and he started doing that, I'd wait till he finished, and then I would just say, Saul Alinsky taught that what you do is if you can't rebut the person, or if you can't have a sound argument, you can't enter a rational discussion with them, you just talk over them. And I would just look at the guy and just say, if you don't mind, I would appreciate you not using that tactic here. Someone needs to call him out on the carpet. We need to call him out on the carpet and stop tolerating that type of thing. And when they start talking over you, you just halt them where they're at and tell them, stop it, stop talking, stop until I get a chance to finish. We have to stop them and get them, because they also know that Saul Alinsky knows is that a particular thing, which, and this is actually, and then we'll address one other thing, he knew that most people are somewhat timid, and so they're not going to stand up against that type of thing, and they'll just let people bowl over them. This is why they go into meetings and they start yelling and screaming and shouting everybody down, right? This is, again, it's just a form of sophistry by trying to force their argument so that it appears like they win. They won the argument because they were the only ones talking when everything was done, and they were the last ones standing. We have to stop tolerating that. Just haul them out. If they can't sit and talk, if they can't sit and listen to somebody else present their argument, just haul them off. Okay. This same thing actually has to be done even in the context of the church. We've got to stop listening to the ones that are trying to push things that are actually contrary to the faith and contrary to what we know that Christ has always taught. And this is, again, because a lot of times they're just, it's... I'll give you a classic example of this. It's this attitude, and this all came up in the context of giving homosexual blessings, right? And the question was, if a homosexual couple comes up to you, can you bless them as a couple? Well, obviously, no, because, and this is the thing that nobody was paying attention, everybody gets sucked into the discussion about, well, you can bless one of them independent of the other, which is actually true, but you can bless one independent of the other, but you can't bless the two together. That was the lesser discussion. No one was talking about the fact that these two shouldn't even be in the presence of each other because they're an occasion of sin to each other. They shouldn't even be around each other. So when they come up, you should have said, hey, you go over there, you go over there. But nobody was even talking about that element. And so you see the whole thing and this is again a tactic. This is actually a tactic of Marxists, but it's actually a tactic of Saul Alinsky. If there's 5 hats on a set of rungs, what you do is instead of, this is what you do. You get people arguing over which of the hats is the better. And you get people arguing about, no, the blue hat's better than the red hat. Well, actually, I think the red hat's better than the blue hat, and this is why I think that. Do you realize they've already got you sucked into the discussion that they want you talking about? You should back up and say, we have no business even talking about the hats. We should be addressing this issue. And it's a diversionary tactic that we're seeing. This is another issue that we actually see in relationship to this. But and part of the sophistry that we're dealing with today, and then we'll stop there, has to do with the news media because of it's a very flashy and a very appealing medium. It tends to have an impact on us, and it tends to give a soundness or a seriousness to what they actually say, when we should just be looking at this and just saying this is all just ridiculous. And why am I going into all this? Where I'm going into all this is because until we stop all of this, we're not going to get the church straightened out. We're not going to get our government straightened out. We're not going to get our culture straightened out until we stop getting sucked into that lesser argument or the things that everybody's getting us sucked in. We need to be able to stand back and look at what's the important things. Where do we really need to go in our own lives and the lives of the church? What are the true things? What are the things that truly need to be addressed and need to our attention, and not get sucked into all this other stuff? This is one of the reasons why literally watching the news media and what's going on in the government has devolved into an entertainment process. Is this person going to win after this? So they're going to beat up. Oh, this guy beat this up. Oh, that was really good that this guy got the better of that guy. And nobody's paying attention to the fact that the government shouldn't even be in any of this. And so this is something that we need to just don't get sidetracked, and just be aware of the fact that when someone's using emotions, or they're using certain things that are flashy, or whatever the case is, or if they're talking over you, you know that it's sophistry, and you need to back up and analyze what is really going on here. Okay. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti super vos sit manet semper. Amen.
Ave Maria Stella, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat.
Getting ready to buy or sell a home? Do you want to help support pro-life organizations? Then you need Real Estate for Life. Get a top-notch real estate agent and support pro-life causes. Go to realestateforlife.org to learn more.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. In the last homily which I had given, which was a little more than 4 weeks ago, I had talked about the virtue of decorum, which is a sub-virtue to the virtue of modesty. And decorum, if you'll remember correctly, is the virtue which helps to determine our speech and exterior comportment so that it fits who and what we are. And now we want to discuss how it deals with externals in relationship to dress. But before we discuss this, however, we need to discuss how God fashioned men and women differently. When Eve was created, God brought Eve to Adam after Adam had been brought all of the other animals to pass judgment onto whether they were suitable partners for him. And he named the animals as a sign of dominion. But when God created Eve and brought Eve to Adam, God put in Eve a natural law inclination. That is, it's something he built into the very nature of femininity, to make sure that she sought the actual approval of Adam's judgment. And that requires that her proper externals would be arranged. And this meant that God placed in Eve a natural law inclination, more so than on the side of Adam, to seek the external judgment of others. Eve has a stronger natural inclination regarding her external appearance as a result. This is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And men, of course, appreciate a woman who is beautiful and well kept. But the point is that God placed in her a natural inclination towards making sure that her external appearance is suited to who she is. And this inclination also affects children, because she makes sure that the children are properly dressed, and that's why women find it easier to go shopping for clothing and things of that sort for children, because it fits their disposition as women. Again, this is a perfection, not something that's bad unless it goes to excess.
But because of this natural law inclination for a woman to be more concerned about her appearance than men, it is why it is more appropriate for a woman to wear makeup and jewelry and things of this sort, which are not proper to men, which do not have the same kind of inclination. And it doesn't mean that men don't have to take care of their appearance, but their finality of their appearance is different. It's more for the sake of the building of virtue and for finding jobs and to have a proper appearance in the relationship to work and things of this sort, rather than to look nice and pretty. Since it is not the place of man to be judged, that is in relationship to externals, but to judge, is why it is not appropriate for men to wear jewelry and makeup, except in the context of the theater, or, as we'll see much later, in the context of trying to restore the order of nature. Given this, we can now begin to discuss how dress will fulfill the virtue of decorum. We're not yet at the stage where we're going to talk about how dress affects matters that pertain to the 6th and 9th commandment, but we just want to talk about how dress needs to fit the person and his circumstances. In the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Lord speaks to Moses and condemns the act of cross-dressing. Quote, "A woman shall not be clothed with man's apparel, neither shall a man use woman's apparel. For he that doth these things is abominable before God," unquote. Now, essentially what this means is that God expects men and women to wear the dress that is proper to their gender. This also manifests clearly that our dress that we wear must fit a particular individual that wears it, not only in relationship to the two genders, which the passage deals with, but in all matters. In other words, part of the virtue of modesty is the virtue of decorum, and part of decorum is that your dress and clothing fits who you are. Cardinal Siri, in a work called The Notification Concerning Women Wearing Men's Clothing, makes a few observations which I think are worthy of reflecting on. He says, firstly, when it comes to covering the female body, the wearing of men's trousers by women cannot be said to constitute as such a grave offense against modesty, because trousers certainly cover more of a woman's body than do modern women's skirts. Now, he's writing this in the context of when skirts were becoming very, very short and grossly immodest. And as a result, he was dealing with the fact that pants aren't as immodest as those skirts. The Cardinal observes, however, that sometimes the trousers are too tight, and therefore it is a matter of the 6th commandment, so women have to be careful in that regard. But he goes on to say that the male dress changes the very psychology of a woman. He says, in truth, the motive impelling women to wear men's dress is always that of imitating, nay, of competing with the man who is considered stronger, less tied down, more independent. This motivation shows clearly that male dress is the visible aid to bringing about a mental attitude of being like a man, which St. Thomas says would be contrary to the first category of natural inclination. The first category of natural inclination is that we preserve our being as it is. Men should like to be men, and women should like to remain women. Secondly, ever since men have been men, the clothing of a person wears conditions, determines, and modifies that person's gestures, attitudes, and behavior, such that from merely being worn outside, clothing comes to impose a particular frame of mind on the inside. So when she changes her dress, it will change how she views herself. It will change her self-image. On the converse of that is, if she has a distorted self-image, it will be manifest in her external dress. Women who go back to wearing skirts or dresses from originally wearing pants often find a psychological shift that occurs within themselves, and they feel more feminine, which is a good thing. Femininity is not something evil. It is a perfection proper to a woman. It's a perfection. Now, this is the sad thing, because the feminist movement has in fact always tried to denigrate the very nature of femininity by throwing it off and trying to become like men. It is as one of my professors once said, feminism is in fact self-hatred, because they hate what it means to be a woman, which is a very sad thing because the perfections of a woman as a woman are quite admirable. A virtuous man is attracted to a virtuous woman, that is, one who is truly feminine. And what a woman wears changes her husband's perspective on her. Her exterior dress affects how he views her. When dating, a virtuous man will be more attracted to a woman who is dressed properly like a woman, because he will have a natural inclination to recognize that she is more modest. That is, she will have more decorum. And that virtue of modesty will attract the virtuous man. The virtuous man turns away from what is immodest. So if a woman wants to attract a man, it's not just a matter of the 6th and 9th commandments, but it's a matter of dressing like a woman. The male dress tends to vitiate relationships between women and men, Cardinal Siri says. The essential basis of mutual attraction is a diversity between the two genders, which is made possible only by their completing and complementing one another. If then this diversity becomes less obvious, because of one of the major external signs is eliminated, and because the normal psychological structure is weakened, what results is the alteration of a fundamental factor in the relationship. To change that clothing which by its diversity reveals and upholds nature's limits and defenses is to level the distinctions and to help pull down the vital defenses of the sense of shame. It is at least to hinder that sense. And when the sense of shame is hindered from applying the brakes, then do relationships between men and women sink degradingly to pure sensuality, to avoid all mutual respect and esteem. Experience teaches us that when women are defeminized, defenses are undermined and weakness increases. The Cardinal is, of course, writing this at a time when women stop dressing like women, and is it at that same time that or shortly thereafter, that there is a collapse, there is a certain progression. When chastity collapses, so does modesty. When modesty collapses, so does decorum. And when decorum collapses, women stop dressing like women, men start dressing like who knows what, and in the end, it just weakens the culture psychologically and spiritually and morally. All children have an instinct for the sense of dignity and decorum of their mother, the Cardinal tells us. Analysis of the first inner crisis of children when they are awakened to life around them, even before they enter upon adolescence, shows how much the sense of their mother counts. Children are as sensitive as can on this point, but we would be well to recall to mind the severe demands that children instinctively make of their own mother, and the deep and even terrible reactions roused in them by observing of their mother's misbehavior. What this means is that children have a natural law inclination towards recognizing what is modest. And if their mother does not dress modesty, it causes an interior dissonance in the mind of the child, and it disturbs him. The child may not know the definition of exposure, frivolity, and infidelity, but he possesses an instinctive sense to recognize them when they occur, to suffer from them and be bitterly wounded by them in his soul. So the Cardinal is observing again that children have a natural sense of when their mother is acting according to the virtue of modesty and when she is not. And we notice that when children notice that their mother is modest, there is a great tenderness that grows in their heart for her, particularly for the male children. The changing of feminine psychology does fundamental and, in the long run, irreparable damage to the family, to conjugal fidelity, to human affections, because affections are affected by our perceptions. And so if a woman wants to disaffect her husband, start dressing like a man. He's attracted to her because she's a woman, not a man. And it also causes harm to the human society. We must therefore answer the question, does the objection of Cardinal Siri to women wearing pants still apply today? Well, I think two distinctions need to be made before we can answer this. There is the distinction between something being sinful and something being less perfect. And then there is also the question of custom. And this is important because it is they used to say that custom has force of law. And it still does, actually, even psychologically. This is a natural law inclination of ours. But this is important since it has become the general custom of women to wear pants today. So when people say that it is sinful for a woman to wear pants, that's based on a misapplication of the quote from Deuteronomy. That in point in fact, the custom has changed. What constitutes female dress has somewhat changed. Given these two observations, it is my own opinion that we can make the following observation. While it is not sinful for a woman to wear pants, since there is a distinction between male and female pants, since they are cut differently to fit differently shaped bodies, nevertheless, it is more perfect, that is, more virtuous for a woman to wear a dress or a skirt than pants. Provided that the pants are not too tight or immodest in this sense, that they do not draw considerations pertaining to the 6th and 9th commandments in men, then they are not necessarily sinful unless by a particular context they are viewed as making a statement against proper femininity or a lack of distinction between men and women. It is more perfect, however, for women to wear a dress or a skirt insofar it is more decorous, and by that it is meant that it is more perfectly fits her as a woman. It's more feminine. It's more feminine looking. And therefore it is more modest because it's more decorous. It fits who she is more perfectly than pants do. Pants are the dress of a worker. And women were not given the task of work. The only reason women have to work is because of some grave necessity. The work was given to her husband, and that's why he wears the pants in the family. And that's meant in more ways than one. If a woman wants to advance in modesty as well as in a number of other virtues, it is to be strongly exhorted that she stops wearing pants and starts wearing a skirt. But on the flip side of that, women should not look down on other women who wear pants, except insofar as those things might be immodest. Wearing a skirt or a dress does not mean it cannot be stylish. We don't have to be Catholic Amish. But it must not be seductive or too tight. That is, draw men into sinful considerations, since sometimes the kind of a skirt a woman wears can actually be worse than a baggy set of pants. The second aspect of modesty in this sense, that is in relationship to decorum, is that when clothing fits due circumstances. And by that we mean that one's clothing fits person and place. For example, it is immodest for a priest to engage in his priestly work without being dressed like a priest. Modesty in this respect is engendered by dress codes, such as was had at Catholic schools in the past where everyone wore a uniform, as well as other uniforms such as those which are worn by sales clerks at certain stores and things of this sort. These clothing create a certain perspective, a certain image in people's minds, and therefore evoke certain psychological reactions, certain forms of behavior. If we want our culture to get its behavior together, to get its act together, one of the first things we have to do is start changing our dress. Uniforms are certain kinds of dress express something about the interior life of the individual who is wearing them. If a person wears sloppy and unkept clothes, it is a sign of interior disorder and spiritual sloth. If a person refuses to wear clothing according to the legitimate custom of a place, it is contrary to modesty. Pope Pius XII, in an allocution to the International Congress of Master Tailors, observes, "Formal clothes, especially aimed at making visible through the richness of their materials and their irreproachable tailoring, the excellence of him who wears them." In other words, the dress makes the man. Not in the sense that if you're not a very good man, if you wear, proper clothing, that somehow you become a man, but that the virtuous man manifests his virtue through proper dress. Then there is, of course, the vice contrary to modesty called admiratio in Latin, or admiration. Now, in English, the term admiration can also mean esteem and respect, but here it means wonder. Admiratio is the vice in which our dress or other externals do not fit our circumstances to such a degree of causing wonder in people when they stop and look at us. For example, if a person has come to Mass and finds somebody in a clown suit, that would be a sin against modesty, since it causes admiratio. Why? because the holy sacrifice of the Mass is the representation of the crucifixion of Christ, which is a grave event. You don't engage in levity at a grave event. This vice can also occur in relationship to other externals, such as hairstyles. For example, the guy who has spiked hair and green coloring in his hair, or tattooing and things of this sort, but we'll talk more about those later. People call it making a statement or self-expression, which is esteemed in our culture, but in point and fact, it is the vice of singularity. Singularity is the vice in which, contrary to holy humility, the person does not seek his place within society, but through a form of expression or through his singularity, he wants to be seen as different, as excelling, as above other people. When in point and fact, the humble man seeks to the private and the secluded life, not the singular, that is, the noted life. And in some cases, admiratio, that is, making this form of expression, is contrary to the virtue of modesty because it causes admiratio. There is the general principle that custom regarding clothing generally binds. Now, obviously, there's times when it doesn't. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But how people dress within the general culture generally binds. Once again, we can take Our Lady as our example, both as to the type of woman that we seek in our culture among women and which we wish them to be, and if you're a man, the type of woman that you want to marry, insofar as the perfection of modesty concerns her. So seek someone like Our Lady. Women should emulate Our Lady in modesty and in decorum. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.